When historians at the Smithsonian Institute first examined the daguerreotype of Civil War soldier Benjamin Clark, they saw nothing unusual. A proud young man in Union blue, standing tall before his departure to battle. But when digital enhancement technology revealed what lurked in his shadow, the image became one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. The shadow showed not a confident soldier, but a man's body hanging lifeless from a rope, swaying gently in death's embrace. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The story begins in 1863, in the small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, where winter had painted the streets in shades of gray and white. Benjamin Clark walked through the town square with the measured gait of a man carrying the weight of destiny on his shoulders. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of rugged handsomeness that made mothers smile approvingly and fathers nod with respect. His dark hair was combed back neatly, and his jawline carried the stubble of a man too preoccupied with larger matters to concern himself with daily shaving. The war had been raging for 2 years now, and Millbrook had sent its share of sons to fight for the Union cause. Some had returned home bearing scars and stories of glory, while others came back in pine boxes draped with the stars and stripes. Benjamin had watched his friends march off to war with a mixture of envy and dread, knowing that his time would eventually come. The draft notices had been circulating through town like autumn leaves on the wind, and his name had finally been called. His mother, Margaret Clark, had spent the morning pacing the kitchen floor of their modest 2-story home on Elm Street. She was a woman of 52 years, with graying hair that she kept pinned back in a practical bun, and hands that bore the calluses of decades spent washing clothes and tending to her family. Her husband, Robert, had died 3 years earlier from consumption, leaving her to raise Benjamin and his younger sister Catherine alone. The thought of losing her son to the war's hungry maw filled her with a terror that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. "You don't have to go," she had whispered to him that morning, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "We could find you work in the textile mills up north. They're always looking for strong backs, and the pay is decent enough." Benjamin had looked at her with those deep brown eyes that reminded her so much of his father. "Ma, you know I can't do that. Every able-bodied man in this town has a duty to serve. I won't be the coward who runs away while others fight for our country." The truth was more complicated than Benjamin let on. He had received a letter 2 weeks earlier that had changed everything. It wasn't from the army or the government, but from a man named Harrison Blackwood, a wealthy merchant from Boston, who claimed to have information about Benjamin's real parentage. The letter suggested that Benjamin wasn't actually the son of Robert Clark, the humble blacksmith, but rather the illegitimate child of a prominent politician whose name Blackwood refused to reveal in writing. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's claims were true, it meant that Benjamin's entire life had been built on a lie. It meant that the man he had called father, the man whose grave he visited every Sunday after church, was nothing more than a kind stranger who had taken pity on his mother. The letter promised answers, but only if Benjamin could pay the sum of $500, more money than his family had ever seen at one time. The war had presented Benjamin with an opportunity. Military service came with a signing bonus, and if he survived the conflict, he would receive additional compensation and land grants. It was a dangerous gamble, but it might be his only chance to uncover the truth about his origins. The weight of this secret had been crushing him for weeks, making him irritable and distant with his family. Catherine, his 17-year-old sister, had noticed the change in him immediately. She was a perceptive girl, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see right through people's carefully constructed facades. She had always been closer to Benjamin than anyone else in the world, sharing secrets and dreams that they kept hidden from their mother's worried gaze. "Something's eating at you," she had said to him one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the bare branches of the oak trees. "You've been acting strange ever since you got that letter." Benjamin had felt his stomach clench with guilt. Catherine didn't know about Blackwood's letter, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her. The possibility that they might not be full siblings was too painful to contemplate. "I'm just nervous about the war," he had lied, hating himself for the deception. Now, as he walked through the town square toward the photography studio of Marcus Whitmore, Benjamin tried to push these troubled thoughts from his mind. His mother had insisted on commissioning a formal portrait before his departure, a memento that would allow her to remember him as he was before the war changed him, assuming he lived long enough to be changed at all. The studio was located on the second floor of a brick building that also housed a dry goods store and a small law office. Benjamin climbed the narrow wooden stairs, each step creaking under his weight, and found himself standing before a door marked with elegant gold lettering that read, M. Whitmore, Photographic Artist. He knocked twice and waited. Marcus Whitmore opened the door with a flourish that suggested he had been expecting this particular visitor. He was a thin man in his 40s, with receding hair and spectacles that seemed perpetually in danger of sliding off his nose. His clothing was impeccable, from his pressed white shirt to his silk vest adorned with a gold pocket watch chain. Photography was still a relatively new profession, and those who practiced it often carried themselves with the air of artists and scientists combined. "Mr. Clark, punctual as always," Whitmore said, stepping aside to allow Benjamin entry into the studio. "I trust you're prepared for what may well be the most important portrait of your life." The studio was unlike anything Benjamin had ever seen. Heavy black curtains blocked out all natural light from the windows, while carefully positioned lamps and reflectors created an artificial illumination that seemed almost magical in its precision. A large camera mounted on a tripod dominated the center of the room, its brass fittings gleaming like jewelry in the lamplight. Bottles of chemicals lined the shelves along the walls, their contents mysterious and slightly threatening to someone unfamiliar with the photographic process. "The daguerreotype process requires absolute stillness," Whitmore explained as he began adjusting his equipment. "Even the slightest movement can blur the image and ruin the entire plate. Some of my subjects find it helpful to think of themselves as statues, frozen in time for posterity." Benjamin nodded and began removing his civilian clothes, revealing the Union uniform that his mother had spent the previous evening pressing until every crease was perfect. The blue wool felt heavy against his skin, and the brass buttons caught the lamplight as he fastened them. The uniform transformed him from Benjamin Clark, the blacksmith's son, into Private Clark of the Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, a man ready to march off to war and perhaps to death. As Whitmore prepared his camera, Benjamin found his mind wandering back to Blackwood's letter. The merchant had been specific about certain details that seemed impossible for an outsider to know. He had mentioned a distinctive birthmark on Benjamin's crater, left shoulder, a crescent-shaped mark that Benjamin had always assumed was simply an accident of nature. Blackwood claimed this mark was hereditary, passed down through generations of a prominent New England family. "Now then," Whitmore said, interrupting Benjamin's troubled thoughts, "I want you to stand just here, with your left foot slightly forward. Rest your hand on this table, and look directly into the camera. Remember, you must remain absolutely motionless for the entire exposure, which will last approximately 30 seconds. Benjamin positioned himself as instructed, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like a shroud. This photograph would likely be the last image of him that his family would possess if the worst should happen. He thought of his mother's tearful face that morning, of Catherine's forced smile as she wished him luck, of all the things he might never have the chance to say or do. The studio fell silent except for the soft hissing of the gas lamps. Whitmore disappeared beneath the black cloth that covered his camera, becoming nothing more than a mysterious figure manipulating unseen controls. Benjamin tried to focus on maintaining perfect stillness, but his mind continued to race with troubling thoughts. What if Blackwood was Cassale, telling the truth? What if his entire sense of identity was built on a foundation of lies? The questions gnawed at him like hungry rats, making it difficult to maintain the composed expression that Whitmore had requested. He found himself thinking about his supposed father, Robert Clark, and all the memories they had shared, teaching him to work the forge, showing him how to shape red-hot iron into useful tools, passing down the wisdom of generations of craftsmen. Had it all been an elaborate performance? Had Robert known that Benjamin wasn't his biological son? The thought was almost too painful to bear. Robert Clark had been a good man, honest and hard-working, the kind of father that any boy would be proud to call his own. If Blackwood's claims were true, then Robert had been even more remarkable than Benjamin had ever imagined. raising another man's child as his own without bell, reservation, or resentment. "Hold steady now," Whitmore called from beneath his black cloth. "The exposure has begun." Benjamin forced himself to focus on the camera lens, trying to project an image of confidence and determination for posterity. He thought about the battles that lay ahead, the friends he would make among his fellow Beat soldiers, the possibility that he might distinguish himself in combat and return home a hero. But even these optimistic thoughts were tinged with the crass shadow of Blackwood's revelations. The 30 seconds felt like an eternity. Benjamin's muscles began to ache from holding the prescribed position, and he found himself fighting the urge to blink or shift his weight. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the studio, and he wondered if the camera would capture this evidence of his nervousness. Finally, Whitmore emerged from behind his camera with a satisfied expression. "Excellent, Mr. Clark. I believe we've captured something quite special. The plate will need to be developed, but I'm confident that the results will please both you and your family." As Benjamin began changing back into his civilian clothes, Whitmore busied himself with the mysterious chemical processes that would transform the exposed plate into a permanent image. The photographer worked with the practiced efficiency of a man who had performed these same operations hundreds of times, measuring chemicals and timing each step with scientific precision. "Will you be departing for the war soon?" Whitmore asked as he worked, his hands never pausing in their careful manipulations. "Tomorrow morning," Benjamin replied, folding his uniform carefully. "The regiment is assembling in Boston, and from there will be shipped south to wherever the fighting is thickest." Whitmore nodded gravely. "I photographed many young men heading off to war over the past 2 years. Some have returned to purchase additional portraits, while others—" he paused delicately. "Well, their families have found comfort in having these final images to remember them by." The comment sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. He tried not to think about the possibility that this photograph might indeed be his final portrait, a frozen moment in time that would outlast his mortal flesh. Instead, he focused on the immediate future, on the journey to Boston and the beginning of his military service. As he prepared to leave the studio, Whitmore handed him a card with elegant script. "The portrait will be ready for collection tomorrow afternoon. I do hope you'll have the opportunity to retrieve it personally before your departure." Benjamin thanked the photographer and made his way back down the creaking stairs to the street below. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the cobblestones and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He walked slowly through the town square, knowing that this might be his last peaceful evening in Millbrook for a very long time. His mother had prepared his favorite meal for supper: roast beef with potatoes and carrots from their small garden, followed by apple pie made from fruit they had preserved the previous autumn. The family ate in relative silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts about the separation that would begin the following morning. After supper, Benjamin sat with Catherine on the front porch, wrapped in heavy coats against the evening chill. The stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, and the distant sound of a train whistle reminded them both of the journey that lay ahead. "I have something for you," Catherine said quietly, reaching into her coat pocket. She produced a small leather journal bound with a silk ribbon. "I thought you might want to write down your experiences so you can share them with us when you return." Benjamin accepted the journal with genuine gratitude, running his fingers over the smooth leather cover. "Thank you, Catherine. I promise I'll fill every page with stories that will make you laugh and cry and everything in between." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights come on in windows throughout the neighborhood. Each illuminated square represented a family, a collection of hopes and fears and dreams that Benjamin was leaving behind in service to a cause larger than himself. "Do you think the war will change you?" Catherine asked suddenly, her voice barely audible in the evening stillness. Benjamin considered the question carefully. He was already changing, had been changing since the moment he received Blackwood's letter. The war might transform him further, but it wouldn't be the only factor shaping his future. "I hope it will make me a better man," he said finally. "More compassionate, more grateful for the things that really matter." That night, Benjamin lay in his narrow bed and listened to the familiar sounds of his childhood home. The old house creaked and settled around him, and he could hear his mother moving about in the kitchen below, probably unable to sleep for worry. He thought about Blackwood's letter, hidden beneath his mattress like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Should he tell his family the truth before leaving? Should he burden them with questions that might never be answered? In the end, he decided that some secrets were too dangerous to share. If he died in the war, there would be no point in destroying his family's happy memories with revelations that might prove to be lies. If he survived and managed to pay Blackwood's price, then he could decide what to do with whatever truth the merchant revealed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting intricate patterns on the bedroom windows. Benjamin dressed carefully in his travel clothes and packed his few belongings into a canvas satchel. His mother had prepared a breakfast of eggs and bacon, but none of them had much appetite for food. The approaching separation hung over the meal like a dark cloud. As they prepared to leave for the train station, Benjamin remembered the photograph. "I need to collect my portrait from Whitmore's studio," he told his mother. "You said you wanted to have it as a keepsake." Margaret Clark's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "Yes, of course. We'll stop there on our way to the station." The walk to Whitmore's studio felt different in the morning light. The familiar streets of Millbrook seemed somehow foreign, as if Benjamin was already beginning his transformation from civilian to soldier. His boots clicked against the cobblestones with a rhythm that reminded him of marching, and he found himself unconsciously straightening his shoulders and lifting his chin. Whitmore was waiting for them with the finished daguerreotype, carefully mounted in an elegant frame of polished wood and brass. The image was remarkably clear, capturing every detail of Benjamin's uniform and every nuance of his expression. He looked confident and determined, a young man ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "One of my finest works," Whitmore declared proudly, as Margaret Clark examined the portrait with careful attention. The lighting was perfect, and Mr. Clark proved to be an excellent subject. This image should preserve beautifully for generations to come. Benjamin studied his own face in the photograph, surprised by how much older and more serious he appeared. The camera had captured something in his expression that he hadn't been aware of, a gravity that spoke of the weight he was carrying. His shadow fell across the floor behind him in the image, a dark silhouette that seemed to anchor him to the earth. They thanked Whitmore and made their way to the train station, where a small crowd had gathered to see Benjamin and two other local men off to war. The locomotive stood waiting like a great iron beast, steam rising from its smokestack and coal smoke staining the morning air. Benjamin embraced his mother and sister, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep and accepting their tearful blessings. As the train pulled away from the station, Benjamin watched Millbrook shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a collection of rooftops and church steeples on the horizon. He settled back in his seat and tried to focus on the future rather than the past, on the battles that lay ahead rather than the secrets he was leaving behind. The journey to Boston took most of the day, the train making frequent stops at small towns and farming communities along the way. Benjamin shared his car with other recruits from throughout Massachusetts, young men from all walks of life united by their common destination and purpose. Some were eager for glory, while others seemed nervous about what lay ahead. Benjamin found himself somewhere in between, curious about the experiences that awaited him, but sobered by the knowledge that many of them would not survive to tell their stories. In Boston, he was processed through the military bureaucracy with efficient impersonality. He received additional equipment, underwent a brief medical examination, and was assigned to the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. The paperwork reduced him to a series of numbers and classifications, stripping away his individuality in preparation for his transformation into a soldier. The next few weeks passed in a blur of training and preparation. Benjamin learned to march in formation, to load and fire his musket with mechanical precision, to follow orders without question or hesitation. He discovered muscles he had never known he possessed, and developed calluses in places that had never been hardened by labor. The physical transformation was accompanied by a mental one, as the individuality of civilian life gave way to the collective identity of military service. His fellow soldiers came from every corner of Massachusetts and beyond. There was Patrick O'Brien, a dock worker from Boston whose Irish accent made him difficult to understand, but whose good humor kept spirits high during the most grueling training exercises. James Washington was a freed slave from New Bedford, who could neither read nor write, but possessed an intuitive understanding of tactics that impressed their officers. David Steinberg had been a clerk in his father's dry goods store in Springfield, a quiet young man who wrote letters home every evening and kept a careful record of his expenses in a small notebook. Benjamin found himself drawn to these men in ways he had never expected. The shared hardships of military life created bonds that transcended the social barriers that would have separated them in civilian society. They looked out for one another, shared their rations during lean times, and told stories around the campfires that revealed their hopes and fears with remarkable honesty. As spring turned to summer, the regiment received orders to move south to join the main Union forces. They traveled by train and ship, passing through cities and landscapes that Benjamin had only read about in books. The journey was uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, but it also opened his eyes to the vastness and diversity of the country he was fighting to preserve. The reality of war struck him during his first major engagement near Petersburg, Virginia. The Confederate forces were well entrenched, and the Union assault became a bloody disaster that left hundreds of men dead or wounded in the space of a few hours. Benjamin found himself crawling through mud, made red with blood, his ears ringing from the constant thunder of artillery, his hands shaking as he tried to reload his musket while bullets whistled overhead. He saw Patrick O'Brien take a Confederate mini-A ball in the chest, the impact spinning him around like a child's toy before he collapsed into the churned earth. James Washington lost his left arm to a piece of exploding shell, and David Steinberg simply vanished during the confusion of a nighttime retreat, his fate unknown and unknowable. The war stripped away Benjamin's romantic notions about military glory and revealed the brutal reality beneath the patriotic rhetoric. Men died in ways that were neither heroic nor meaningful, their lives snuffed out by random chance rather than acts of valor. The survivors carried on not because they were brave, but because they had no choice, because the alternative to fighting was desertion and shame. During quiet moments between battles, Benjamin wrote in the journal that Catherine had given him, trying to capture the experiences that words seemed inadequate to describe. He wrote about the sounds of battle, the smell of gunpowder and death, the way fear could make a man's bowels turn to water. He also wrote about the unexpected moments of beauty that could emerge even in the midst of horror. A sunset painting the sky crimson over a battlefield, the sound of someone playing a harmonica in the darkness, the simple pleasure of a hot meal after days of hardtack and cold coffee. As the months passed, Benjamin found himself changing in ways that went deeper than the obvious physical transformations. The naive young man who had posed for his portrait in Whitmore's studio was being replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic, someone who understood that survival often required compromises that his former self would have found unthinkable. He learned to sleep through artillery bombardments, to eat his rations without thinking about what might be crawling in them, to step over dead bodies as if they were fallen logs blocking a forest path. He developed a soldier's thousand-yard stare, the distant expression that came from seeing too much death and suffering. His letters home became shorter and less frequent, not because he cared less about his family, but because the gulf between his experiences and their understanding seemed impossible to bridge with mere words. The war dragged on through 1864 and into 1865, each season bringing new campaigns and new casualties. Benjamin was promoted to corporal after showing leadership during a particularly difficult retreat, and later to sergeant when his company commander was killed by a sniper's bullet. He found that he had a talent for keeping men alive, for making the kinds of tactical decisions that minimized losses while still accomplishing military objectives. By the spring of 1865, it was becoming clear that the Confederacy was collapsing. Union forces were advancing on multiple fronts, and the enemy's ability to resist was crumbling under the combined weight of superior numbers and resources. Benjamin's regiment participated in the final push toward Richmond, the Confederate capital, and he was present when the city finally fell to Union forces. The end came with surprising suddenness. One day they were fighting desperate battles against determined Confederate defenders, and the next, they were marching through the streets of Richmond as conquering heroes. The war that had consumed so many lives and resources simply faded away, leaving behind a country that would need to rebuild itself from the ruins of conflict. Benjamin survived the war, but he was not the same man who had posed for his portrait in Millbrook 3 years earlier. The uniform that had once made him stand tall now felt like the costume of a character he no longer recognized. He had seen too much death, made too many difficult decisions, lost too many friends to ever return completely to the innocent young man he had been. As he prepared for demobilization and the journey home, Benjamin thought about Blackwood's letter, still hidden among his personal effects like a time bomb waiting to explode. He had saved enough money from his military pay to meet the merchant's demands, but he was no longer sure he wanted to know the truth about his parentage. The war had taught him that some knowledge came at too high a price, that some secrets were better left buried. The train that carried him back to Massachusetts passed through landscapes that bore the scars of conflict. Burned buildings, abandoned farms, and overgrown cemeteries served as reminders of the war's terrible cost. Benjamin pressed his face to the window and watched these scenes of devastation scroll past, wondering what his own homecoming would bring. Millbrook looked smaller than he remembered, as if the war had somehow shrunk the world of his childhood. The familiar streets and buildings seemed almost toy-like after the vast scale of military campaigns and battlefields. His mother and Catherine were waiting at the train station, their faces lined with worry and anticipation. The reunion was both joyful and awkward. Benjamin embraced his family with genuine affection, but he could see the questions in their eyes, the attempts to reconcile the man who had returned with the boy who had left. He was thinner now, marked by visible scars and invisible wounds that would take years to heal. His hands shook sometimes, especially when he heard sudden loud noises, and he found it difficult to sleep through the night without nightmares. Margaret Clark had kept his portrait on the mantelpiece throughout his absence, and Benjamin was struck by the contrast between the confident young man in the photograph and the battle-weary veteran who now stood before it parade. The image seemed to mock him with its innocent optimism, its belief that war would be a grand adventure rather than a grinding ordeal of survival. As the weeks passed, Benjamin struggled to readjust to civilian life. The skills that had kept him alive during the war seemed useless in peacetime Millbrook. He found himself startled by children playing in the streets, mistaking their shouts for cries of alarm. The sound of the blacksmith's hammer reminded him too much of gunfire, and he avoided his father's old workshop. He tried to resume the life he had left behind, but it felt like wearing clothes that no longer fit properly. His friends who had not served in the war seemed impossibly young and naive, concerned with trivial matters that struck him as meaningless after what he had witnessed. Those who had served understood him better, but they were often as damaged as he was, struggling with their own demons and seeking solace in alcohol or isolation. It was during this difficult period of adjustment that Benjamin finally decided to contact Harrison Blackwood. The merchant's letter had lost none of its power to disturb him, and the questions it raised seemed more urgent now that he had survived the war against all odds. He wrote to Blackwood, agreeing to meet and to pay the requested sum in exchange for the promised revelations. The meeting took place in a Boston hotel, in a private dining room that spoke of wealth and discretion. Blackwood proved to be a thin, elegantly dressed man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. He examined Benjamin with the attention of a jeweler appraising a precious stone, noting details that would have been invisible to a casual observer. "You have your father's eyes," Blackwood said without preamble, accepting the envelope of money that Benjamin offered. "And his stubborn chin. I knew Charles Pemberton well, before politics and scandal drove him into exile." The name meant nothing to Benjamin, but Blackwood's expression suggested that it should. The merchant opened a leather portfolio and withdrew a collection of documents, photographs, and letters that he spread across the table like a dealer arranging cards for an elaborate game. Charles Pemberton was one of Massachusetts' most promising young politicians in the 1830s, Blackwood explained, his voice taking on the tone of the teacher addressing a student. He served in the state legislature and seemed destined for higher office, perhaps even the governor's mansion. But he made the mistake of falling in love with a woman who was not his wife. Benjamin stared at a daguerreotype that showed a man bearing an unmistakable resemblance to his own features. The same dark eyes, the same strong jawline, even the same slightly crooked smile that Benjamin recognized from looking at his reflection in mirrors. "Your mother was very beautiful in those days," Blackwood continued, producing another photograph that showed a young woman who could only be Margaret Clark. She was perhaps 20 years younger, dressed in fine clothing that Benjamin had never seen her wear. Pemberton was completely smitten, and she with him. Their affair lasted nearly 2 years before it became public knowledge. The scandal had destroyed Pemberton's political career and nearly ruined his marriage. He had fled Massachusetts for California, where he had died in a mining accident just 5 years later. Margaret Clark had been left pregnant and disgraced, forced to rely on the kindness of Robert Clark, a man who had loved her silently for years and was willing to claim another man's child as his own. "Your legal father was a remarkable man," Blackwood acknowledged. "Not many men would have shown such generosity under the circumstances. He gave you his name and his love without reservation, and he never spoke of the truth to anyone, not even to you." Benjamin felt as if the world was shifting around him, as if the foundations of his identity were crumbling beneath his feet. Everything he had believed about himself, about his family, about his place in the world, had been built on carefully constructed lies. Robert Clark had indeed been his father in every way that mattered, but not in the way that Benjamin had always assumed. "Why are you telling me this?" Benjamin asked, his voice barely steady. "What do you gain from destroying my peace of mind?" Blackwood's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of genuine sympathy beneath his businesslike demeanor. "Because you have a right to know the truth about your origins, and because your biological father left behind a considerable inheritance that has been held in trust, waiting for his legitimate heirs to claim it." The inheritance was substantial: property in California, investments in mining and railroad stocks, and cash holdings that totaled more than $50,000. It was enough money to transform Benjamin's life completely, to lift his family out of poverty and provide them with security for generations to come. But it came with a price that went beyond Blackwood's fee. "Claiming the inheritance will require you to acknowledge your true parentage," Blackwood explained. "The legal documents will become part of the public record, and the scandal that destroyed your father's career will be revived. Your mother's reputation will be damaged, and your family will have to live with the consequences of decisions made before you were born." Benjamin stared at the documents spread across the table, trying to process the magnitude of what he was being offered. The money could solve all of his family's financial problems, but it would come at the cost of their social standing and their carefully preserved secrets. His mother would be revealed as an adulteress. Robert Clark's memory would be tainted by the revelation that he had been a cuckold, and Benjamin himself would be branded as a bastard. "I need time to think," Benjamin said finally, gathering up the photographs and documents that Blackwood had shown him. "This is not a decision I can make lightly." Blackwood nodded understandingly. "Of course. The inheritance has waited this long. It can wait a little longer. But don't wait too long, Mr. Clark. Or should I say, Mr. Pemberton. The legal processes involved are complex, and there are other potential claimants who might come forward if you delay too long." Benjamin returned to Millbrook with his mind in turmoil, the photographs and documents hidden in his traveling bag like evidence of some terrible crime. He found himself looking at his mother with new eyes, trying to reconcile the respectable widow she had become with the passionate young woman who had risked everything for love. He wondered if she had ever regretted her choices, if she had ever looked at him and seen Charles Pemberton's face staring back at her. The decision consumed his thoughts for weeks. He would lie awake at night, weighing the potential benefits against the certain costs, trying to imagine how his family would react to the revelations. The money would allow his mother to stop taking in washing to make ends meet, would provide Catherine with the education she deserved, would give all of them a chance at a better life, but it would also destroy the foundation of trust and respectability upon which their family was built. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn, Benjamin made his choice. He wrote a letter to Blackwood, declining to pursue the inheritance and requesting that all documents related to his parentage be destroyed. The money, however substantial, was not worth the price that his family would have to pay. Some secrets, he decided, were worth preserving, even at great personal cost. He burned Blackwood's original letter and the photographs that night, watching the flames consume the evidence of his true parentage. The fire reduced Charles Pemberton to ash and smoke. erasing him from Benjamin's life as completely as death had erased him from the world. Robert Clark would remain his father in memory and in truth, the man who had shaped his character and given him the strength to make difficult decisions. The portrait that Whitmore had taken still occupied its place of honor on the mantelpiece, and Benjamin found himself studying it with new understanding. The young man in the photograph had been full of questions about his identity, uncertain about his place in the world. The veteran who now stood before it had found his answers, not in blood and birth, but in the choices he had made and the values he had embraced. Years passed, and Benjamin gradually found his place in the post-war world. He married Catherine's best friend, a gentle young woman named Elizabeth who understood his silences and helped him heal from his war wounds. They had children together, and Benjamin discovered that fatherhood came naturally to him, perhaps because he had been blessed with such excellent examples of what it meant to be a father. He never spoke to anyone about Blackwood's revelations, carrying the secret as his own burden rather than sharing it with his family. His mother lived to be 78, never knowing that her carefully guarded secret had been discovered and then deliberately forgotten. Catherine married a teacher from Springfield and raised 4 children of her own, never learning that the brother she adored was only her half-brother. Benjamin lived to be 73 years old, long enough to see the country heal from the wounds of civil war and to watch his own children grow into adults. On his deathbed, surrounded by family and friends, he thought about the choice he had made all those years ago. The $50,000 would have made many things easier, but it would not have made them better. The love of a good father, whether biological or chosen, was worth more than any inheritance. His portrait was passed down through generations of the Clark family, a reminder of a young man's courage and the sacrifices made by an entire generation. For more than a century, it hung in various family homes, accumulating the patina of age, but losing none of its power to evoke memories of a simpler time when right and wrong seemed more clearly defined. It was not until 2008 that the portrait came to the attention of professional historians. Benjamin's great-great-grandson, researching his family history for a genealogy project, donated the daguerreotype to the Smithsonian Institution, along with several other family artifacts. The museum's experts were interested in the portrait primarily as an example of Civil War-era photography, representative of the thousands of similar images taken before young men departed for battle. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in 19th-century photography, was the first to notice something unusual about the image. While cataloging the portrait for the museum's collection, she observed that the shadow cast by Benjamin's figure seemed inconsistent with his posture and the lighting conditions in Whitmore's studio. The anomaly was subtle, visible only when the image was examined under magnification, but it was definitely present. Shadows don't lie, Dr. Martinez explained to her colleagues during a staff meeting. They're created by the interaction of light and form, and they follow predictable physical laws. But this shadow doesn't match the subject's actual position. The discovery led to a comprehensive analysis using digital enhancement technology that had not been available to previous generations of researchers. When the image was processed through sophisticated computer programs designed to reveal hidden details, the shadow revealed its terrifying secret. Instead of showing Benjamin Clark standing confidently in his uniform, the enhanced shadow depicted the unmistakable silhouette of a human figure suspended from a rope, the body twisted at an unnatural angle that could only indicate death by hanging. The revelation sent shockwaves through the historical community. Dr. Martinez assembled a team of experts from various disciplines to examine the photograph and attempt to explain the impossible anomaly. Physicists studied the lighting conditions. Photography specialists analyzed the daguerreotype process, and historians researched Benjamin Clark's military service record with unprecedented thoroughness. "We've examined every aspect of this image," Dr. Martinez announced during a press conference that attracted national media attention. The photograph itself is authentic, dating from 1863 based on the chemical composition of the photographic plate and the style of the uniform. There's no evidence of manipulation or double exposure, techniques that would have been extremely difficult to achieve with the daguerreotype process of that era. The mystery deepened when researchers discovered Benjamin Clark's complete military records in the National Archives, contrary to what his shadow seemed to predict. Benjamin had not died by hanging during the Civil War. In fact, he had served with distinction, surviving numerous battles and returning home safely in 1865. He had lived for decades after the war, married, raised children, and died peacefully in his own bed in 1906. Every document we found confirms that Benjamin Clark lived a long and productive life after the war, explained Dr. Robert Chen, a historian specializing in Civil War military records. He was promoted to sergeant, received commendations for bravery, and was present at the surrender of Confederate forces in Virginia. There's absolutely no indication that he ever faced execution by hanging or came close to such a fate. The impossible nature of the shadow's prophecy only added to the mystery's appeal. News outlets around the world picked up the story, and the Smithsonian found itself inundated with visitors eager to see the photograph for themselves. The museum was forced to install special security measures to protect the fragile boss. Daguerreotype from the crowds of curious onlookers who came to witness what many were calling the most haunting mystery in American history. Amateur investigators and conspiracy. Theorists offered dozens of explanations for the anomalous shadow. Some suggested that Benjamin Clark had possessed psychic abilities that allowed his shadow to reveal his ultimate fate, even though that fate had never actually occurred. Others proposed that the photograph had somehow captured an image from an alternate timeline, a parallel universe where Benjamin's story had ended very differently. Religious groups seized upon the image as evidence of divine intervention or supernatural phenomena. Several televangelists claimed that the shadow represented a spiritual warning, a glimpse into the fate that would have awaited Benjamin if he had not found redemption through military service. New Age practitioners suggested that the photograph had captured Benjamin's shadow self, the dark aspects of his personality that he had successfully overcome through his war experiences. Scientists remained skeptical of these supernatural explanations, but they struggled to provide a rational alternative. The laws of physics seemed to offer no mechanism by which a shadow could depict something other than the object casting it. The daguerreotype process, while complex, was well understood, and experts could find no technical explanation for how such an anomaly could have occurred. Dr. Martinez and her team spent months examining similar photographs from the same era, hoping to find other examples of impossible shadows or unexplained anomalies. They analyzed thousands of Civil War portraits stored in museums and private collections across the country, but Benjamin Clark's photograph remained unique. Whatever had caused his shadow to deviate from reality appeared to be a singular occurrence, impossible to replicate or explain. The investigation took an unexpected turn when researchers decided to examine Marcus Whitmore's other photographic work from the same period. The photographer's studio records had been preserved by his descendants, providing a detailed account of his clients and their portraits during the Civil War years. What they discovered added another layer of mystery to an already incomprehensible puzzle. Whitmore had photographed 17 other young men departing for military service during the same week that he had created Benjamin Clark's portrait. Of those 17 men, 12 had died during the war, most of them in battle, but some from disease or accident. The mortality rate among Whitmore's subjects was actually higher than the average for Massachusetts regiments, a grim coincidence that might have been attributable to the random nature of warfare. But there was one detail that chilled the researchers to the bone. Of the 12 men who had died, 3 had been executed by hanging for desertion or other military crimes. Their shadows in Whitmore's photographs appeared perfectly normal, showing no hint of their eventual fate. Only Benjamin Clark's shadow had revealed a death that never came to pass, a prophecy that remained unfulfilled. The discovery prompted a renewed investigation into Benjamin's life and military service. Historians combed through regimental records, personal letters, and contemporary newspaper accounts, searching for any indication that he might have faced charges that could have resulted in execution. They found references to his promotions and commendations, testimonials to his courage and leadership, but nothing that suggested he had ever been in danger of facing a military tribunal. Dr. Martinez's team also attempted to trace Benjamin's family history, hoping to find some clue that might explain the shadow's ominous message. They discovered the story of his parents' marriage, Robert Clark's generosity in raising another man's child, and the family's struggles during the post-war years. But nothing in the historical record suggested any connection to the dark fate depicted in his shadow. The investigation might have continued indefinitely, if not for a chance discovery made by Benjamin's great-great-great-granddaughter, Rebecca Clark Morrison, a retired librarian from Oregon who had been preyed, following the story in the news. While cleaning out her late mother's attic, she discovered a trunk containing Benjamin's personal effects from his military service, including the leather journal that his sister Catherine had given him before his departure for Beta War. The journal contained Benjamin's own account of his military experiences, written in his careful handwriting during quiet moments between battles. Most of the entries dealt with the routine hardships of Army life, descriptions of marches and encampments, observations about his fellow soldiers, and reflections on the nature of war and courage. But one entry, dated December 15, 1864, stood out from the rest. "Today I came closer to death than I have since the war began," Benjamin had written, his usually steady handwriting betraying signs of agitation. Not from enemy bullets or artillery, but from the cruel justice of military law. A man in our company, Private Davidson, was caught deserting his post during last night's engagement. The court-martial was swift, and the sentence was death by hanging. I was selected to serve on the firing squad that would carry out the execution, but at the last moment, Colonel Williams decided that hanging would serve as a better deterrent to other potential deserters." End quote. The entry continued with a description of the execution, held at dawn in a clearing near the regiment's winter camp. Benjamin had been ordered to help construct the gallows, a grim task that had filled him with revulsion and dread. As the moment of execution approached, however, an unexpected development had changed everything. Just as the noose was placed around Davidson's neck, a Confederate raiding party attacked our camp, Benjamin had written. The hanging was postponed, as every available man was called to repel the assault. During the battle, Davidson managed to escape from his guards and disappeared into the woods. He was never recaptured, and the colonel decided that pursuing him would be a waste of valuable resources. The entry concluded with a reflection that sent chills down Rebecca Morrison's spine as she read it more than a century and a half later. "I helped to build that gallows, and for a moment I stood where Davidson would have stood, testing the rope and the mechanism that would have ended his life. As I stood there with the noose around my neck, even in jest, I felt as though death itself was measuring me for a shroud. The sensation was so vivid that I found myself wondering if somehow, in some other world or time, it might be my own neck in that noose instead of Davidson's." The journal entry provided a rational explanation for the shadow's impossible prophecy. Benjamin Clark had indeed stood with a noose around his neck, if only briefly, and in preparation for another man's execution. Somehow, the daguerreotype had captured not his actual shadow at the moment of exposure, but the shadow of his deepest fear, the image of the fate he had narrowly escaped. But this explanation raised as many questions as it answered. How could a photographic process capture an image from the subject's memory or imagination rather than his physical reality? The daguerreotype was a chemical process, dependent on the interaction of light and silver compounds, not on the thoughts or feelings of the person being photographed. There was no known mechanism by which Benjamin's psychological state could have influenced the physical properties of his shadow. Dr. Martinez and her team considered various possibilities. Perhaps Benjamin had unconsciously adopted a posture reminiscent of his traumatic experience while posing for the portrait. Perhaps the stress of his impending departure for war had caused him to relive the moment of standing on the gallows, creating some kind of psychosomatic effect that had somehow influenced the photographic process. But these explanations seemed inadequate to account for the precision and detail of the shadow's prophecy. The silhouette showed not just a hanging figure, but specific details of posture and position that corresponded exactly to Benjamin's description of the gallows he had helped to construct. It was as if the photograph had somehow reached into his memory and extracted the most traumatic moment of his military service. The mystery attracted the attention of researchers from fields far removed from history and photography. Quantum physicists speculated about the possibility that consciousness could influence physical reality in ways that science had not yet discovered. Psychologists studied the case as an example of how traumatic memories might manifest in unexpected ways. Paranormal investigators saw it as evidence of psychic phenomena that challenged conventional understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. None of these experts could provide a definitive explanation for the impossible shadow. The photograph remained an enigma, a window into a mystery that seemed to exist at the intersection of science and the supernatural. The Smithsonian eventually created a permanent exhibit around the portrait, presenting it as an unsolved puzzle that continued to challenge researchers and visitors alike. The story of Benjamin Clark's prophetic shadow became part of American folklore, inspiring books, documentaries, and countless theories about the nature of time, consciousness, and reality itself. Some people saw it as proof that the future was predetermined, that fate could cast its shadow backward through time to warn of dangers that lay ahead. Others interpreted it as evidence that the past and future were more interconnected than science had previously believed. For Rebecca Morrison, her ancestors' story served as a reminder of the complexity and mystery that lay hidden in every family history. She donated the journal to the Smithsonian, where it was displayed alongside the portrait as part of the ongoing investigation. The two artifacts together told a story that was both deeply personal and universally mysterious, a tale of one man's brush with fate and the shadow that somehow knew what was coming. The mystery might have remained forever unsolved if not for a breakthrough that came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a neuroscientist studying the relationship between memory and perception, became interested in Benjamin's case while researching how traumatic experiences could influence sensory processing. Her work with military veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress had revealed that the brain sometimes processed traumatic memories as if they were current reality, creating vivid flashbacks that felt more real than actual present-moment experiences. Dr. Vasquez proposed that Benjamin Clark had experienced what she termed a temporal displacement event while posing for his portrait. The stress of his impending departure for war, combined with his subconscious memories of the near execution, had created a psychological state in which his traumatic memory became temporarily more vivid and real than his actual physical position in Whitmore's studio. The human brain doesn't always distinguish clearly between remembered experiences and present reality, Dr. Vasquez explained during a lecture at Harvard Medical School. Under conditions of extreme stress, traumatic memories can intrude into present awareness with such intensity that they temporarily override normal sensory input. It's possible that Benjamin Clark's mind was so focused on his memory of standing on the gallows that this memory somehow influenced the photographic process. End quote. Her theory suggested that consciousness might interact with physical reality in ways that science was only beginning to understand. If thoughts and memories could influence matter at the quantum level, perhaps Benjamin's intense psychological state had somehow affected the silver compounds in Whitmore's photographic plate, creating an image that reflected his inner reality rather than his external appearance. The theory remained speculative, but it offered the most plausible explanation for an otherwise impossible phenomenon. Other researchers began investigating similar cases, looking for instances where strong emotional states or traumatic memories might have influenced photographic images. They found a few isolated examples of anomalous shadows or unexplained figures in old photographs, but none as dramatic or well documented as Benjamin Clark's prophetic portrait. As the years passed, the mystery of the impossible shadow became a touchstone for discussions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between mind and matter, and the possibility that reality was far more complex and interconnected than everyday experience suggested. The photograph served as a reminder that even in an age of scientific rationalism, there remained phenomena that challenged human understanding and defied easy explanation. Benjamin Clark himself would probably have been amused by the attention his portrait received more than a century after his death. He had been a practical man, shaped by the harsh realities of war and the necessities of survival. He had faced his fears, made difficult choices, and lived his life according to principles of honor and compassion that he had learned from the man he had always considered his true father. The shadow that had somehow predicted a death that never came might have been a manifestation of his deepest anxieties, a glimpse into an alternate timeline, or simply an inexplicable anomaly that would forever remain beyond human comprehension. But for Benjamin, the important thing had not been the mystery of his shadow, but the choices he had made in the light. His portrait continued to hang in the Smithsonian, drawing thousands of visitors each year who came to see the impossible shadow and ponder its meaning. Some saw it as a ghost story, others as a scientific puzzle, and still others as a meditation on the nature of fate and free will. But perhaps the most appropriate interpretation was the simplest. It was the portrait of a young man who had faced the possibility of death and had chosen to live, who had confronted his fears and had found the courage to move forward despite them. The shadow would always remain a mystery, but the man who cast it had been entirely real. Benjamin Clark had lived and loved, served his country and raised his children, and passed on to future generations the values and virtues that had sustained him through the darkest moments of his life. His impossible shadow might have predicted death, but his actual life had been a testament to the power of hope, courage, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. In the end, the most remarkable thing about Benjamin Clark's photograph was not the mystery of its prophetic shadow, but the story of the man himself, a young soldier who had faced the unknown with determination and had found his way home to the people he loved. The shadow might have shown death, but the man had chosen life, and that choice had echoed through the generations, inspiring others to face their own fears with similar courage and resolve. The mystery of the impossible shadow would continue to puzzle researchers and fascinate the public for years to come. But Benjamin Clark's true legacy was not the enigma of his portrait, but the example of his life. He had been a good son, a brave soldier, and a loving father, and those qualities had proven far more enduring than any photographic anomaly. The shadow had predicted death, but the man had achieved something far more valuable. He had lived a life worth remembering. As the story of Benjamin's impossible shadow spread through social media and documentary films, it attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Vatican's Office for Investigating Miracles sent a representative to examine the photograph, wondering if it might represent some form of divine intervention or supernatural warning. Islamic scholars debated whether the shadow could be interpreted as evidence of predestination, while Buddhist monks saw it as a manifestation of the interconnectedness of all things across time and space. The photograph became a pilgrimage site of sorts, with visitors from around the world traveling to the Smithsonian specifically to see Benjamin's portrait. Many came seeking answers to their own questions about fate and mortality, hoping that somehow the mysterious shadow might provide insight into their own futures. Others arrived as skeptics, determined to debunk what they saw as an elaborate hoax or misinterpretation of photographic artifacts. Among the most dedicated investigators was Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic photographer who specialized in analyzing historical images for evidence of manipulation or fraud. He spent 6 months studying Benjamin's portrait using every technique available to modern science, from electron microscopy to spectral analysis. His conclusion was unequivocal. The photograph was genuine, created using authentic 1860s daguerreotype techniques, with no evidence of double exposure, manipulation, or fraud. "I've examined thousands of photographs suspected of being fakes or altered images," Dr. Harrison announced during a presentation at the International Conference on Forensic Photography. "This is not a hoax. Whatever created this impossible shadow, it was not human intervention or photographic trickery. We're looking at something that challenges our fundamental understanding of how images are created and preserved." The authenticity of the photograph only deepened its mystery and increased public fascination. Television networks produced documentaries exploring various theories about the shadow's origin, from quantum mechanics to paranormal phenomena. The History Channel aired a 6-part series titled Shadows of Time, which examined Benjamin's story alongside other unexplained historical artifacts. The series drew record viewership and spawned countless online discussions and amateur investigations. Rebecca Morrison found herself thrust into the role of family spokesperson, fielding interview requests from journalists and researchers from around the world. She discovered relatives she had never known existed, distant cousins and great-nephews who emerged from genealogical research inspired by Benjamin's newfound fame. Many of them possessed their own family artifacts and stories that added new dimensions to Benjamin's legacy. One such relative, Dr. Catherine Clark Williams, a psychology professor at the University of Virginia, had inherited a collection of letters that Benjamin had written to his sister Catherine during the war. These letters provided additional context for his psychological state during the period leading up to his portrait session. They revealed a young man wrestling with profound questions about identity, purpose, and mortality, themes that took on new significance in light of his prophetic shadow. "My dear sister," Benjamin had written in a letter dated 2 weeks before his portrait was taken, "I find myself haunted by dreams of death, not the glorious death of a hero in battle, but something darker and more shameful. I wake in the night with the sensation of rope around my throat, though I know not why such visions plague me. Perhaps it is merely the anxiety of a man facing an uncertain future, but the dreams feel more real than my waking hours." The letter suggested that Benjamin had been experiencing premonitory dreams about hanging even before the traumatic incident with Private Davidson's near execution. This revelation added another layer to Dr. Vasquez's psychological explanation, suggesting that Benjamin's prophetic shadow might have been the result of recurring nightmares rather than a single traumatic memory. Other letters revealed Benjamin's internal struggle with the secrets he carried, particularly his knowledge of his true parentage. He wrote eloquently about the burden of hidden truths and the way that unspoken secrets could cast shadows over even the happiest moments. These reflections took on new meaning when considered alongside his impossible shadow, as if his unconscious mind had found a way to make his metaphorical shadows literally visible. The investigation into Benjamin's life also uncovered previously unknown details about Marcus Whitmore, the photographer who had created the mysterious portrait. Whitmore's descendants had preserved not only his business records, but also his personal diary, which contained his own account of the unusual portrait session. "Young Clark seemed troubled during our session," Whitmore had written on the day after taking Benjamin's photograph. "He maintained perfect stillness as required, but there was something in his expression that spoke of deep inner turmoil. When I developed the plate, I noticed an unusual quality to the shadows, as if they had been cast by a different light than what illuminated the studio. I attributed this to some peculiarity of the chemical process, but now I wonder if there might be forces at work that photography is only beginning to reveal." Whitmore's diary also contained sketches of various photographic experiments he had conducted, attempting to capture what he called the invisible emanations of the human spirit. He believed that photography might be capable of recording more than just visible light, perhaps somehow documenting the emotional and spiritual states of his subjects. His sketches showed various attempts to photograph people in states of extreme emotion, hoping to capture some visual evidence of their inner experience. These revelations painted Whitmore as more than just a commercial photographer, but as an early pioneer in what might be called paranormal photography. His belief that cameras could capture invisible aspects of reality provided another possible explanation for Benjamin's impossible shadow. Perhaps Whitmore's experimental techniques had somehow made his equipment sensitive to psychological emanations that normally remained invisible. The story attracted the attention of Dr. James Randi, the famous skeptic and debunker of paranormal claims, who traveled to the Smithsonian to examine the photograph personally. Despite his reputation for exposing fraudulent supernatural phenomena, Randi was unable to provide a conventional explanation for Benjamin's shadow. His examination confirmed the findings of other experts. The photograph was genuine and unmanipulated, created using authentic 19th century techniques. "I've spent my career exposing fake psychics, fraudulent mediums, and staged paranormal events," Randi admitted during a press conference following his investigation. "But this photograph presents a genuine mystery that I cannot explain through conventional means. I'm not prepared to accept supernatural explanations, but I must acknowledge that current scientific understanding may be inadequate to account for what we're seeing here." End quote. Randi's endorsement of the mystery's authenticity lent additional credibility to the investigation and sparked renewed scientific interest in the phenomenon. The National Science Foundation awarded a research grant to study the photograph and similar anomalous images, hoping to identify previously unknown aspects of photographic chemistry or quantum mechanics that might explain such impossibilities. The research team, led by Dr. Maria Santos from MIT, conducted extensive experiments attempting to recreate conditions that might produce similar shadow anomalies. They photographed subjects under various forms of psychological stress, exposed photographic plates to different types of electromagnetic radiation, and even attempted to use meditation and visualization techniques to influence photographic outcomes. Despite months of careful experimentation, they were unable to replicate Benjamin's impossible shadow. "We've explored every conventional explanation we can think of," Dr. Santos reported to the NSF Review Committee. "The phenomenon appears to be unique, possibly the result of a combination of factors that occurred only once in photographic history. We may be looking at evidence of previously unknown interactions between consciousness and matter, or we may simply be witnessing an extremely rare quantum event that defies statistical probability." End quote. The failure to replicate the phenomenon only increased its significance in the scientific community. Researchers began investigating other historical photographs with renewed attention, looking for similar anomalies that might have been overlooked or dismissed as defects. They found a handful of images that contained unexplained elements, shadows that didn't quite match their subjects, or figures that appeared in supposedly empty spaces. One particularly intriguing discovery was made in the archives of the Library of Congress, where researchers found a Civil War-era photograph of a group of soldiers that contained what appeared to be the ghost of a fallen comrade standing among them. Unlike Benjamin's shadow, this figure was clearly visible to casual observation, but military records confirmed that the ghostly soldier had died in battle 3 days before the photograph was taken. These discoveries suggested that Benjamin's portrait might not be entirely unique, but rather part of a previously unrecognized category of anomalous historical photographs. The researchers began developing protocols for identifying and studying such images, hoping to find patterns that might reveal the underlying mechanisms responsible for these impossible captures. The international attention surrounding Benjamin's photograph also inspired amateur investigators to search their own family collections for unusual images. Thousands of photographs were submitted to the Smithsonian for analysis, though most proved to be examples of conventional photographic defects, or pareidolia, the tendency to see meaningful patterns in random visual information. However, a few submitted photographs showed genuine anomalies that defied easy explanation. A family in Ireland possessed a 19th-century portrait of their ancestor that showed his reflection in a mirror displaying a completely different facial expression than the subject himself. A collector in Japan owned a photograph of a geisha that showed her shadow dancing even though the woman herself was standing perfectly still. These discoveries suggested that anomalous photography might have been more common in the early days of the medium than previously recognized. Perhaps the primitive chemistry and lengthy exposure times of early photographic processes had made cameras temporarily sensitive to phenomena that modern equipment could no longer detect. Dr. Martinez established an international database of anomalous historical photographs, cataloging each image and its provenance in hopes of identifying common factors that might explain their impossible characteristics. The database grew to include more than 300 authenticated images from around the world, spanning the period from photography's invention in the 1830s through the early 20th century. Analysis of the database revealed several interesting patterns. Anomalous photographs were most common during periods of social upheaval, particularly wars, epidemics, and natural disasters. They were more likely to be found in photographs of individuals facing major life transitions, such as marriage, military service, or emigration, and they appeared to be most frequent in images created by photographers who had expressed interest in spiritualism or the supernatural. These patterns suggested that anomalous photography might be related to heightened emotional states or psychological stress, supporting Dr. Vasquez's theory about the interaction between consciousness and physical reality. The database became a valuable resource for researchers studying the intersection of psychology, physics, and photographic chemistry. Benjamin Clark's impossible shadow had evolved from a single mysterious image into the centerpiece of a new field of scientific inquiry. Universities began offering courses in anomalous photography, and scholarly journals published papers on the quantum mechanics of consciousness and its potential effects on matter. The photograph that had once been simply a family keepsake had become a catalyst for expanding human understanding of reality itself. As the investigation continued into its second decade, new technologies provided additional tools for analyzing Benjamin's portrait. Quantum computers were used to model possible interactions between consciousness and photographic chemistry, while advances in brain imaging allowed researchers to study the neural correlates of traumatic memory formation. Each new analytical technique revealed additional layers of complexity in the mystery. The portrait's fame also inspired artists and writers to create works exploring themes of fate, prophecy, and the relationship between past and future. A Broadway musical titled Shadows of Time told Benjamin's story through song and dance, while a best-selling novel imagined a world where prophetic photographs were common and their subjects lived in fear of their predicted fates. Benjamin Clark himself had become a symbol of resilience and courage in the face of an uncertain future. Schools taught his story as an example of how individuals could overcome adversity and choose their own destinies, despite seemingly insurmountable challenges. His portrait served as a reminder that the future was not fixed, that even the darkest prophecies could be overcome through determination and moral courage. The mystery of his impossible shadow continued to inspire new generations of researchers and investigators, each bringing fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to the puzzle. Some focused on the psychological aspects of the phenomenon, while others explored its implications for our understanding of time and causality. Still others saw it as evidence of dimensions of reality that science had not yet learned to perceive or measure. Rebecca Morrison, now in her 80s, continued to serve as the keeper of her family's story and the guardian of Benjamin's legacy. She had written a memoir about her experience discovering the journal and witnessing her ancestors rise to international fame, donating the proceeds to fund continued research into anomalous photography. Benjamin never sought fame or recognition, she wrote in the memoir's conclusion. He was simply a young man trying to do his duty and find his place in the world. The fact that his portrait has inspired so much scientific investigation and philosophical reflection would probably surprise him, but I think he would be pleased to know that his story continues to help people grapple with life's deepest mysteries. The photograph remained on display at the Smithsonian, where it continued to draw visitors from around the world. Each person who stood before it brought their own questions and interpretations, adding to the rich tapestry of meaning that had grown around Benjamin's impossible shadow. The mystery might never be fully solved, but its capacity to inspire wonder, curiosity, and reflection seemed limitless. In the end, perhaps that was Benjamin Clark's greatest legacy. Not the solution to his portrait's mystery, but the questions it raised about the nature of reality, consciousness, and human potential. His impossible shadow had become a window into the unknown, a reminder that even in an age of scientific certainty, there remained mysteries that challenged human understanding and invited continued exploration. The young soldier who had once stood nervously in Marcus Whitmore's studio, worried about his future and burdened by family secrets, had achieved a form of immortality that he never could have imagined. His story would continue to inspire researchers, artists, and philosophers for generations to come, ensuring that the mystery of his prophetic shadow would never be forgotten.